More uneasy, Aven adjusted her grip on the leather handle, reminding herself that she had read the sign right. The Norgaard farm. This had to be it. She'd traveled too far and too long to be in the wrong spot. Seeming displeased, the man shoved back the sleeve cuffs of his plaid shirt, and finally he thumbed over his shoulder. Apparently the lad hadn't the gift of the gab. And why she was thinking of him as a lad was beyond her. The man seemed more grown than she at her 21. Looking nearly as sturdy as the tree behind him, he had more than a few stones on her as well. His gaze freeing her own, he angled away and thumbed farther up the lane again. Aye, she should be moving on. That way, it seemed. She gave a quiet thank you, and he nodded, his brown-eyed gaze on her as she passed by. 'Twas but a few steps ahead that Aven halted. This man had the same brow as her Ben, one bearing the noble angles of Norse blood. Though the stranger's hair was a far cry from Ben's pale locks, she saw something in his manner. That same strapping stance and pensive look. Might you be one of the Norgaards? She hoped her accent wasn't too thick for him. It seemed Americans had a hard time with her dialect. With 2 buckets apart from the rest, he stacked them. The gaze that landed back to her was apprehensive. He had a wildness about him, and combined with his silence, her unease only grew. But then he nodded. Aven smiled a little. No stranger, but family. I'm Aven, widow to Ben. The man nodded again, as if having known as much. Perhaps this was an uncle to the children. But why Dorothée didn't mention an uncle? So, Aven pointed past him, and when a strand of rust-colored hair whipped into her face, she twisted it away. I'm to walk this way? He dipped his head once more, which had her smiling again. I thank you, Mr. Norgaard. Clutching the handle of her carpet bag tightly, she continued down the lane, feeling his eyes on her. Strange bloke. She walked on another few moments. Then she spotted a large red house up ahead. Faded and weather-beaten, it looked more like a giant barn than a home. But with its porch swing and laundry line, 'twas clearly the latter. Aven glanced back to see she was being followed. From a fair distance, she'd give him that. But it still had her eyeing the man with every few trees they passed, until the orchard opened up into a vast yard. Thick, twisted branches giving way to sheds and outbuildings. 2 of the structures were massive, a distant one was charred, and around many sat stacks upon stacks of wooden crates and more metal buckets than she'd ever seen in one farmyard. Her companion stopped and folded his arms over his chest. Hesitantly, Aven continued up the path the same moment a second man emerged from the house. Though as tall as the first, this one's strength was wiry. His hair was a few shades lighter, but just as long, judging by the way it was pulled back and bound. Heavy boots stomped down the steps. Another Norgaard? She glanced around for a sight of the children, but saw nary a toy about, and the clothing pinned to the line was by no means pint-sized. Aven regarded the stranger on the porch, and resisted the urge to touch her mother's delicate chain around her neck, as she often did when nervous. Hello, sir. She stepped closer and extended a hand, which seemed very small when wrapped in his own. I'm Aven. I was married to Ben. That seemed odd to blurt out, but she didn't know how many of these introductions were to take place. Oh. He studied her a moment. A pleasure to finally meet you, ma'am. He cleared his throat and gave his name. Jorgen. She knew that name from Aunt Dorothee's many letters. But Jorgen was to be a wee lad, and this man was no such thing. Aven scrutinized him. Dorothée had certainly not portrayed the sons as men. Before she could make sense of that, another one stepped from the house. Though the third brother's charms had been described in great detail, his great-aunt's praises didn't do justice for who could only be a very grown-up Håkon. The young man's brilliant blue eyes took her in, and though he was clean-shaven, his brawn dashed any lingering notion of the Norgaard offspring being children. Even as panic rose, Jorgen spoke. And this is Håkon. He's the youngest. Pear in hand, Håkon cut a slice and used the flat of the knife to raise it to his mouth. Nothing.